One of the things that I think that many people who are concerned about colonialism often don't bear in mind is that one of the worst ways that colonialism has influenced people in minorities is in an intellectual capacity. We can all see the influences of colonialism in the nations that were colonized, but this isn't purely just in a material sense. It isn't purely the constructions of Westerners, their economic activities, and so forth. It is also latent in the diasporae that are in Western countries and also in the governments of the previously colonized countries themselves. And I would say that this is actually one of the biggest problems that nobody actually addresses. This isn't just because the ideas that are contained in this ideological colonialism are somehow just from another culture, but because the ideas that have been generated by this are not only assumed in current studies into whiteness or current studies into postcolonialism, but also because they're just wrong. Now, people shouldn't be worried about this purely because they don't correspond to reality, which we'll point out later on in the video, but because these ideas are so wrong, they actually threaten to completely destroy minority communities in the West, and also the countries which they came from. This is because the basis for this thought fundamentally lacks any rational way of grounding morality, and therefore the structures of families, and therefore the continuation of a community, but we'll explain first of all how this comes about. Now, who could possibly be posing such a threat to minority communities? Well, the answer is pretty simple. The most influential academic at the moment in the academy is Michel Foucault. This man was a postmodern French philosopher who was writing throughout the middle of the 20th century. Now, he is particularly important because of his influence, but it's important to acknowledge that many of his ideas found their inception in earlier thought from Europe. So this would include Karl Marx from Germany, this would include Jean-Jacques Rousseau from France, and many other figures. Fundamentally, the thing that we face here is that the basis of whiteness studies and the basis of all this oppressor-oppressed dichotomy and all of these structures of power or social construct theory, all of these things originate in white people, largely in French, German and British universities. So aside from the obvious problem for people who are supporting decolonisation, is that their entire ideology is found in a German and in two Frenchmen, with a couple of other people, Anton Gramsci, an Italian. These thinkers are fundamentally European at their root, and all of these decolonial movements find their synthesis in the ideas that these people are thinking. So ultimately, a person who takes a decolonial view or an anti-colonial view will ultimately be feeding from the intellectuals of Europe across the 18th, 19th and 20th centuries. This is simple fact. But this isn't a particularly strong argument against these ideas. If they're good ideas, then it makes sense for a community to adapt them and to continue to hold them. So let's actually discuss the mistakes in these thinkers that actually mean that an honest holding of any view built on their particular presuppositions, that this will lead to the collapse of any sort of community. So the first example I'd like to point to was a debate between Michel Foucault and Noam Chomsky. And although Chomsky holds the more sane view that human beings have innate characteristics, Michel Foucault holds a view of man that is far from uncommon in modern Western thought. And by modern Western thought, I mean that starting in 1650. And that is that there is no such thing as a innate human nature. This emerges out of a philosophical idea which poisons everything it touches called nominalism. Foucault, so far as I understand, held to a nominalist position, meaning that he didn't believe in the existence of true categories of things. He believed purely in names. So the human race doesn't actually exist besides a name that we give. So there are many, many problems from this that are necessary corollaries that will impact minority communities. The first one being is that through his denial of the existence of a human essence, that means that there's no way of actually sustaining any kind of sensible morality, because sensible morality looks at man's good and constructs rules, or receives rules, that conduct him in line with his conscience and with his greater good. In the context of a society, this would be known as the common good. Now, if you don't have any idea what a man is, you say that a man is simply a name, then you have no way of actually creating an objective morality, and therefore everything goes crazy. If there is no such thing as a human nature, then that means that we can't make any kind of statement about human nature at all. We cannot say, for example, that definitively racism is wrong, because there is no innate human nature to anybody inherently, because the human nature doesn't exist. We also can't say things like they have a right to life, liberty, or property, because there is no such thing as a human being. There is no such thing as a right that covers all people. There is nothing grounding it anymore. There is only what goes on in a person's mind and what they think that they can have. This is a world of might makes right. And so very strangely, it would seem as if the oppressed have no legal measure, concrete in reality, to actually defend themselves here. So, by removing the existence of a human nature, he has destroyed justice. So there you go. When you read people who take this as their presupposition, you're reading works that effectively provide no actual grounding for your own rights beyond, I think so. It also doesn't make sense, because it seems like human beings are oddly able to get on quite well for groups that are only names. We can reproduce together and produce fertile offspring. We all have arms and legs and genitals and things like that, and when somebody is lacking something, we call it a disability. This is why there's a much more sensible view, wherein these categories actually exist, and when somebody deviates from those things, we call them in some sense disabled or deprived of something. So for example, say that I lose my arm in a horrible car accident. I don't cease to be human. I cease to have an arm, which would be a privation. And this becomes even more of a problem when you realise that human beings are completely distinct from other animals in the sense that they possess a will and an intellect. A mind which, although it can be influenced through the circumstances around him, as Foucault acknowledges and perhaps overstates, it is still fundamentally free, because there are no fundamental physical restrictions on it. As we can think, imagine, and experience as we please, independent from concrete reality, we also know that our minds aren't divisible into parts, yet every human being still possesses one, and when they don't show signs of possessing one, we call them disabled. Why is this? Because there is such a thing as a human essence, and Michel Foucault's denial of this doesn't correspond to reality. As a side note, for those who deny the immateriality of the intellect, I will place a link in the description which explains why it is necessary. The third problem that comes out of Foucault's conception that man is the consequence of his material and social status, that being economic and social, is that this would imply that human nature is changeable. He denies the existence of an innate human status. Now, the problem with this is that this has been an assumption in many people's thinking since the Enlightenment. So, for example, the idea that we can somehow perfect man under a socialist state. This has failed manifestly under the USSR. I think that this entire view, which I think was encapsulated most clearly by Jean-Jacques Rousseau when he said, "Man is born free, yet everywhere he is in chains," indicating that man in his natural savage state, as he calls it, was optimal. I think that this is best responded to in the work of Joseph de Maistre called Against Rousseau, where he points out that sheep are born carnivores, yet everywhere they eat grass. When Rousseau points to the social institutions exterior to man that influence his development in a negative manner, he forgets that these are ultimately just outgrowths of man's nature in the first place. And de Maistre, in his work Against Rousseau, points this out completely. He points out that the problem that Rousseau is making, and by extension every single person who thinks that the changing of social and political institutions will somehow change human nature, the mistake that they're making is that they fail to understand that the social institutions that are supposedly oppressing people are outgrowths of man's inherent nature, and therefore man's inherent nature must have some sort of error, which he would put down to original sin. In some ways, it's a real shame that people think like this, because many of the problems are mitigatable if we simply acknowledged this innate fallenness that man has and started to focus on the solutions that we once had. For example, you have feminists who will rightly call out, teach men not to rape, because there is a high incidence of sexual assault and rape in this country. Now, they think that they can simply change social institutions and what they teach and this will solve the problem. This is nonsense, because it doesn't understand where the fault lies. The fault lies fundamentally in man's human nature, first of all, and second of all, because men nowadays are so unchaste and so undisciplined sexually that it becomes very easy for a man to place his sexual pleasure over the dignity of a woman. But that's for another video. Another very serious problem that dominates some of academia, and I believe this begins with Hegel, is the idea that the first principle of all things that are in existence are ideas. So ultimately there's no such thing as a mind-independent reality considered as it is, but our thoughts and our opinions and our mind and our ability to think is the very first thing that you assume when you're doing philosophy. Now, you may think that this might be a very esoteric thing to take an issue with, but the problem is that that means that if you're not presupposing reality first, then you're ultimately placing the definition of reality on your mind and how you perceive it, which is wrong. You know, we're constantly surprised. We constantly fall into problems that we weren't anticipating. There's obviously a mind-independent reality there. And this is also shown in the problem with this view, and that is that when a person assumes that their thought is first, I think, therefore I am. The problem is this actually assumes two things. This assumes, as it states, the ability to think, but it also presumes that the ability to think, or the mind considered as thinking, exists. It presupposes there's such a thing as existence. So why wouldn't you just discard this and just begin with being? Why wouldn't you just talk about existence as considered independent of this and not get trapped in your own mind? This is why I think a lot of people nowadays tend to look down on philosophers, because they start out with what they're thinking in their own minds, and they start out with pure theory and things like this without considering reality considered mind independent first. If people do this inside of movements for minorities or for any other group, then this will ultimately mean that they will be stuck inside of their own heads and not in reality. So if you want to have some sort of actually effective way of running your community so they don't die out, beyond of course what I've just said about Foucault, you're going to want to dodge this idea as well, because you need to operate inside of reality. You can't operate inside of theory, because reality isn't theory. Finally, and probably most importantly, it's the moral problem of the denial of the first principle of all being, which is God. Nietzsche may have said that God is dead and we have killed him. But the problem is that this entire worldview is contingent on previous thinkers, namely Immanuel Kant, who believed that truth didn't actually exist as an independent object, but was only existent in particular statements. So, for example, there's no such thing as truth. It doesn't make sense to speak in that way. It makes sense to ask, is the water on my desk currently? And this would be something that would evaluate to true. The problem is that in this case, this would mean that all being would be possessed by every single separate thing, and therefore the existence of things would be reckoned relative to every other thing. So then you would have problems like, what happens if something is destroyed? What happens if something is, created, right? If I am born, how does that influence things? It means that there is ultimately a relative reckoning of being, because things pass in and out of being. I expound on this further in another video that I will put as a card if you want to watch this at length. But beyond this seemingly esoteric rambling that I'm engaging in, you can see the moral chaos that's latent in all of the revolutions that have originated in the Enlightenment. The first one being the French, with the terror and the Thermidorian reaction and things such as this, but also in the Russian Revolution, It is said that at one point a third of all of the women in Petrograd, which was the capital of the Russian Empire at this point, were prostitutes during the October Revolution. We also see this revolutionary, on quote, attitude towards morality, which is admittedly variant between groups, also in people like Jacques Derrida and in Michel Foucault, who voted for the legalization of sex with younger people in the 1970s. Now, of course, this isn't a universal thing. Communists are very much not keen on things like homosexuality because of the fact that these are bourgeois things. But the fact of the matter is that this is still moral decadence in comparison to the previous rule of the churches, in particular the Roman Catholic Church. So in short, basically, you accept these ideas and you accept a moral decadence in your community which will drive down birth rates and destroy social cohesion to the point that there will be no community left. I think that we can establish this pretty clearly based on what I've just said. Now, how do we actually provide ourselves with some sort of bearing in reality without relying too much on Western thought? Well, accepting one Western thinker who I would very much recommend to everybody, St. Augustine, who was somebody who was an Algerian man who was writing in the 4th and 5th centuries. There are plenty of Eastern thinkers who have provided solutions to these problems through various homilies and writings. One that very much springs to mind, although he's sometimes in error, as with all writers, is St. John Chrysostom, who was a Syrian man who was writing at around the same time. I will provide links to all of these people in the description, by the way, as I'm mentioning them. Another person, known for his great Syriac poetry, and who lived in the east of the Roman Empire in the 4th and, I believe, early 5th century, would be St. Ephrem the Syrian. He wrote a lot of poetry about virtue and about the stories of the Bible, which of course itself was written by Jews who were living in the Levant, beginning around 1300 BC, working its way forward to around about 100 AD. You have also St. Athanasius of Alexandria, who was an Egyptian Greek writer who was writing during the 4th century. And finally, another thinker who at least dwelt in Asia was St. Maximus the Confessor, who wrote a great deal about moral systems and the moral living of one's life in his various writings. I will put down a great big list in the description of other thinkers that you might want to check out and flesh out your way of thinking for the sake of your community and for the sake of living in accordance with reality. Thank you very much for watching.